Since 2016, Ontario annually marks this as Treaties Recognition Week. Charnel Anderson covers the Northwest for Ontario Hubs, and she joins us now from Thunder Bay for more about the Robinson-Superior Treaty of 1850, which covers a huge swath across the north shores of Lake Huron and Lake Superior. Welcome, Charnel.
Hi, Dan.
All right, so the treaty I mentioned, the Robinson-Superior Treaty of 1850, has some special significance to one Thunder Bay man you spoke to. What's the family connection there?
That's right. So for this piece that I worked on, I spoke to David Thompson, who works at Dennis Franklin Cromartie High School in Thunder Bay. And actually one of his relatives, so it's his grandfather's great-grandfather, so that would be his great-great-great-great-great-grandfather, was his name was Chief Manadogene. And so Chief Manadogene was an Indigenous leader in the Lake Nipigon area in the mid-19th century. And so this was, during a time of rapid European expansion. There were government agents traveling around looking for natural resources and trying to negotiate treaties with, the Indigenous people that lived in the area so the government could access those natural resources. And so the government agent had met Chief Potachat of Fort William, who they had considered the spokesman for the Anishinaabe groups in the area, even though these were distinct groups. But the government agents and Chief Potachat were able to negotiate the terms of a treaty, and eventually in September of 1850, Chief Potachat and Chief Manadogene and others traveled down to Sault Ste. Marie to sign the Robinson-Superior Treaty, which, of course, forms the basis of the relationship between Indigenous groups in the region and the Crown.
So, as you mentioned, there's a lot of history there, and I'm curious, how did he discover that history and go back so many decades and family generations?
So David spent a lot of time with his grandfather when he was younger. During the summers, they would go visiting the Lake Nipigon area where they would spend time fishing at his grandfather's uncle's fishing grounds, trying to catch whitefish. And, David was pretty young during this time, but he would listen to the conversations that his older relatives were having, about their family and about residential schools and about their family that didn't come back from residential schools. And, as a young kid, David says he didn't, fully understand or appreciate the stories that he heard. But of course, now as an adult, he sees the significance of these stories and the events that they recount and how they're tied to the present. Because, on one hand, it is his personal family history, but the stories also reveal a lot about the history of the region and, these events that have led us to where we are today.
I want to talk about the chiefs that signed the Robinson-Superior Treaty in terms of education. Did they want a sort of European settler education for their children? What was sort of the scope in terms of what they wanted?
Yeah, so, many of the chiefs did want European style education because they had seen, the changes that were happening around them as a result of colonialism. And so they wanted Western education to kind of augment the traditional knowledge that was already being passed down, in order for their communities to adapt to the changes that were happening. And so education wasn't an explicit provision in the Robinson-Superior Treaty, as it is in subsequent treaties. But David said that Chief Manadogene's understanding was that, if he had signed the Robinson-Superior Treaty of 1850, the Crown would provide a teacher for his community. He told his community members as much and asked them to wait for a teacher to come, and when the teacher did come, to embrace them. And sadly, Chief Manadogene died waiting, but eventually a teacher would come to the Lake Nipigon area.
Of course, what they asked for was not what they got. Ultimately, it was residential schools. When did what they wanted transition sort of into what they got?
So the seeds of what would eventually become the residential school system were actually already planted before Chief Manadogene had requested a teacher for his community. The first residential school opened in the 1830s in what is now Brantford. And so that's, 20 years before the signing of the Robinson-Superior Treaty in 1850. But I think, because Northern Ontario and, the Lake Nipigon region in particular was so remote and isolated, it took a while for missionaries and government agents to get up here and for the residential school system to spread. But I think a good example of this phenomenon is the Shingwauk Residential School, which was named after Chief Shingwauk Owens in Garden River, who had a vision of education for his community that would preserve Anishinaabe knowledge while also teaching Western knowledge like reading and writing in English. But as Paul Sayers, who works at Algoma University, and he's actually a descendant of Chief Shingwakones, as Paul told me, even though the school was named after Chief Shingwakones, his true vision wasn't manifested in the school. The Anglican Church, which ran the school, had appropriated his vision and turned it into the Shingwak Residential School, which, of course, ultimately played a role in, the cultural genocide of Anishinaabe people.
All right, I want to show a brief clip of your interview with David, just talking about sort of the education system and really sort of the next steps moving forward. Let's have a look at that.
We are the grandchildren and children who are still living with the fallout from that those past traumas, and but we're very resilient people, and we haven't forgotten, or at least we've been taught, to be proud of who we are as Anishinaabe people, and then who we were and who we are and who we can be is still real for us.
Now, you had mentioned Shingwak Hall Residential School, Sault Ste. Marie. That's 600 kilometers east of where David grew up in Nipissing, but he does have that family connection. Talk to me a little bit about that connection that he has with that school so far away.
So, after the Shingwak Residential School was built, and before there was a school in Lake Nipissing, E.F. Wilson, who was a missionary, but he was also Shingwak's first principal, him and Bishop Fauquier, who was an administrator at Shingwak, went on a missionary tour to Lake Nipissing. And, as I mentioned, the community in Lake Nipissing was waiting for a teacher to come. And, Wilson explained, that's not what we're here for, but we can take back one or two kids to Shingwak so they can go to school there. And so the chief at the time, who was actually Chief Manadoshian's son, offered to let the missionaries take his son, called Ningwenana, back to Shingwak. And so that's what they did. But sadly, Ningwenana got really sick, and within, I believe it was about 8 months, he ended up dying at Shingwak from tuberculosis. And so he was the first of David's relatives to die while attending Shingwak. But 3 more of David's relatives, Kathleen, Fred, and Frank Manadosian, also died while attending Shingwak. And, so every year or so, David goes down to the Shingwak Cemetery in Sault Ste. Marie to visit Kathleen, Fred, Frank, and Ningwenana. And, he's brought his daughter there when she was born, and he plans on taking, his young grandson there as well, as he said, to ensure the continuation of his family history.
My last question to you, David is an educator in Thunder Bay, and I want to read a quote that he says. He says, "It's amazing how much knowledge and wisdom there is in Anishinaabe education. It's not something of the past." How is he working to reclaim that?
So David works as a land-based coordinator at DFC. And, so there he teaches the traditional Anishinaabe practices that he had learned from his grandparents. So they'll go out, it really depends on the time of year, but they'll go out and do everything from goose and duck hunting, fishing, setting snares, berry picking, wild rice harvesting, you name it. And, he does this in a way so that it connects with the curriculum. So he'll work with the math and science teachers to find, a land-based activity that connects to the curriculum. And so, it's this really neat fusion of traditional Anishinaabe practices and the standard curriculum, which, feels like it aligns more with, the vision that Chief Manadosian and Chief Shingwakones had for education for their communities.
Charnel, really great story, really great stuff. Thank you so much for joining us on the program.
Thanks, Jan.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.